Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom, AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the second half of our talk on the end of the Cold War and rise of nationalism post World War II. Now, as always, take a minute, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms. And note, we will be starting the lecture outline today at point number 4, nationalism since 1945. Now with that, let's get started right away. Now, even as we're talking about the end of the Soviet Union, and a lot of that had to do with rise of nationalism among the middle class of the Russians, among those Eastern European nations, whether the Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, Bulgaria, Albania, Germany. All these nations rose with nationalist ideas and intentions. At the same time, though, this was a larger trend post 1945, post World War II. As you see this quote on the screen right here, European powers began to experience the disintegration of this is not about Soviet Union here, but the European powers, the traditional powers, began to experience the disintegration of their colonial empires after World War II. Now, even as the Soviets begin to build theirs, the rest of Europe is actually beginning to lose their empires. In fact, between 1947 and 1962, almost every colonial territory gained independence. And we're talking about Europe here, not the United States. And again, along with this, new nations in Asia and Africa were deeply influenced by the Western ideals and achievements. Now, what are the causes of this? Well, modern nationalism and a belief in self-determination. Again, we used that word a lot in the last lecture. It's back again. Modern nationalism and the belief in self-determination, of racial equality. Again, so we talk about U.S. history very well in this period. Spread not only from intellectuals, but they went from the intellectual period, the intellectual phase of just the elites, to the masses. It wasn't just the intellectuals or those at universities who began talking about nationalism, self-determination, racial equality. No, this was now being talked about by the general populace, the masses of people. And they are the ones who will help to push for greater independence, greater autonomy, and of course, nationalist ideas. In addition, after 1945, Europe was in shambles, and they became more concerned about rebuilding Europe than dealing with their colonial, empire. So colonies became less of a priority post-World War II. Let's go through a few of these now and show you just some different regions of the world and how they dealt and got their independence from Europe. And we're going to start, as you see on your screen, in India. And India will play a key role for everyone else. Much like, the Berlin Wall's falling did for Eastern Europe, the issue where what went on in India becomes this linchpin, this turning point for the rest of the world in regards to colonies overthrowing their, imperial powers. And of course, this has been going on since, before World War I with the Indian National Congress. And because of the Indian National Congress, Britain had no choice but to develop a native political elite. And for a while, they were able to control that political elite, but over time, they began to become more exposed to Western ideals of things like nationalism, socialism, democracy. And by the, early 20th century, post-World War I, you start seeing a major push for independence in India. And of course, this would be led in large part by Mohandas Gandhi. Because after World War I, he begins pushing the principle that became known as passive resistance or nonviolent civil disobedience. And nonviolent civil disobedience becomes a very powerful tool, especially for ethnic and racial minorities, as a way to challenge the laws, to suffer unjustly for unjust laws. And by breaking the laws in a nonviolent manner, it begins to challenge and use the court system to actually change laws and change people's minds. Of course, this would be very popular not only for India, for other decolonized nations, of course, in the United States with the African American civil rights, and with, of course, with the Chicano movement. And while Gandhi gets most of the credit, it will actually be Jawaharlal Nehru who will be the one who will lead the Congress and actually eventually gain Indian independence from Great Britain. Well, let's talk about Vietnam. Always a popular topic. I wish we had more time in this class to discuss Vietnam. It's a fascinating situation in the Vietnam War in general. But that would be a non-European course, so let's just talk about the kind of quick version of this, which is after Japan is removed after World War II, the French decide, hey, we want to reassert our dominance of this region known as Indochina, this region that is nowadays Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Well, in the northern half of what became Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, pictured on the right there, he begins to lead an independence movement to overthrow the French in northern Vietnam, which he does successfully. In 1954, they will defeat the French forces, and in 1954, Vietnam is now divided in half, north and south. North Vietnam will be ruled by Ho Chi Minh, who of course is communist, and the south will given tacit independence from France, but will be supported by the French government, and at the very least, while they're not democratic at all, they are at least Western leaning or pro-Western southern Vietnam. And of course, if you know the story back from US history or world history, there will be a large Vietnam War, which is one of those proxy wars of the Cold War, to which the United States is going to eventually lose its tenuous hold over South Vietnam, will withdraw in 1973, and by 1975, Ho Chi Minh is able to reunite Vietnam under communism. Let me repeat. By 1975, the US has been gone. They refuse to help the South Vietnamese, and Ho Chi Minh is able to take and reunify unified Vietnam without Western control. In the Middle East, Arab nationalism is springing up all throughout. In response to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Britain had been pushing for an independent Israeli state, a home in Palestine, their traditional biblical home. Of course, this was being opposed by people like Saudi Arabia and Transjordan. Now, in 1948, Britain announced its withdrawal from Palestine. And the United Nations voted on the creation of two states, one for the Arab nation and one for the Jewish nation. And of course, both Arabs and Jews are going to have extreme nationalism and pride that they want their own land. And there will be continuous conflict from prior to World War II all the way through the present day. And you can see the amount of land lost through these various wars. In Africa, the Arab defeat in 1948 by Israel triggered a successful nationalist revolution in Egypt that in 1952 ended British control of Egypt. In 1956, Egyptian president nationalized the Suez Canal. Again, the last symbol and substance of Western power in the Middle East. For as long as anyone can remember, the British and Western influence was dominated in large part because of the Suez Canal that connected the regions together for trade purposes. By nationalizing it under the Egyptian control, Egypt is able to wrest any kind of economic, social, political control away from Western powers. And of course, in response to that, France, Great Britain, and Israel attacked Egypt, trying to take it back. But ultimately, it is the US and the Soviet Union who will demand their withdrawal, and the canal will remain in Egypt's control. Algeria had a large French population, and many considered Algeria an integral part of France, but did not want to give its independence again because of the large French population. A bitter war breaks out between French and Algerian nationalists. Charles de Gaulle, you see pictured on the right, who had returned to power as part of the movement to keep Algeria as part of France, ultimately would have to accept Algerian self-determination. Again, note the self-determination, nationalist ideas. In 1962, after more than a century of French rule, Algeria becomes independent and the European population quickly leaves. In sub-Saharan Africa, decolonization was a little more smooth than it was in northern Africa. The British Commonwealth of Nations, beginning in 1957 with Ghana, British colonies would achieve independence with little or no bloodshed. And they will enter a loose association with Great Britain itself. Again, this nationalist movement, each nation wanting their independence, asserting their independence under nationalist ideas and self-determination post-World War II. Whereas things were pretty bloodless and quick when it came to sub-Saharan Africa, in Yugoslavia, things were much more deadly and long-lasting. In 1990, the Serbian president, Slobodan Milosevic, he had dominated, as a Serbian, dominated Yugoslavia and sought to establish tighter controls over these previous autonomous regions. In response, both Croatia and Slovenia declared independence, and each fought Serbia successfully to grant their independence. Not to be outdone, Bosnia-Herzegovina declared its independence in March of 1992, leading to a civil war there. Now you realize Bosnian Serbs were about 30% of the population, and they refused to live in a Muslim-dominated state. And they began military operations assisted by Serbia and the Yugoslav army. This would lead to ethnic cleansing in the region as Bosnian Serbs tried to liquidate and or remove Muslims by shelling cities, confiscating or destroying houses, gang rape, expulsion, and murder. Several 100,000 Bosnians are killed, slaughtered, decimated in this ethnic cleansing. Finally, in 1995, we will have the Dayton Agreements that agrees to divide Bosnia between the Muslims and the Serbs. Things will heat up again at the end of the decade, 1999, as the U.S. begins to intervene once again, because Milosevic agreed in 1999, he attempted to ethnically cleanse Kosovo of ethnic Albanians. Now, Kosovo, as you see pictured on the map, was a province of Serbia. And Milosevic deeply wants to, well, again, commit genocide and rid the country of ethnic Albanians. NATO, led by the United States and Bill Clinton, will bomb Serbia nonstop in order to stop the ethnic cleansing. All of which will lead to extreme animosity in the Middle East against the United States. Milosevic will finally be removed from power in 2000. He will be placed under international charges for war crimes, but will die in prison in 2006 before he was even tried. In the end, as a result of this, Montenegro will vote for its independence in 2006, and thus eliminating the last vestige of Yugoslavia. So a very tumultuous time in the 1990s. But finally in 2000, with the ousting and imprisonment of Milosevic, the final vestige of the former Yugoslavia will come to an end in 2006 when Montenegro gets its independence. Now, not to be outdone, back over in Europe proper, in Western Europe, things are not so smooth there as well post-World War II. The Irish Republican Army, the IRA, they will terrorize English cities, this time much more violent than they were previously. And they terrorize English cities, demanding Northern Ireland be returned back to, well, Ireland. And so there will be extreme warfare, terrorist activity in Great Britain as a result of this. In France, and throughout Europe, and in the United States as well. The other big issue with nationalism, it also often coincided, as you should be able to figure out by now, with xenophobia. And we saw that issue with Yugoslavia, right? The ethnic cleansing issue. Nationalism wants self-determination for particular large ethnic groups. And as a result, it often follows with that is xenophobia, the fear of immigrants. And in this case, back in Western Europe, the issue of xenophobia was that of guest workers. This became a big issue in the United States as well, especially with Mexican and Caribbean laborers who were known as guest workers on these visas. And in France, especially, guest workers became a major source of tension among these right wing nationalists. They want to keep their country, well, reserved for their people and screw everybody else. And in France, the big issue was Northern African immigrants. In Germany and Austria, the issue was Turkish immigrants. And one of the big proponents of the xenophobia was the man pictured there, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the most outspoken opponent of both immigration and the French integration into the European Union. Now, we'll talk about the European Union in our next and last lecture. But think about that for a minute. One of the big things of this period is nationalism and is self-determination. And yet, we're going to see the transformation of Europe into the European Union. And this becomes one of the big sticking points for people like Great Britain, people like France, is they don't want to give up their autonomy and nationalist agendas to give in to the European Union. And we see a new wave of that currently with Brexit, as Great Britain is now leaving the European Union. And while there's some good economic reasons for that, remember, it's being led largely by hard right-wing conservatives who believe strongly in nationalism, the new wave of nationalism post-2015, 2016. So you see what happens is, at the same time the Soviet Union is building and then ultimately collapsing, the rest of the world is also undergoing the same principled ideas of nationalism, self-determination, greater racial equality, or if they can't give racial equality, then to separate into two separate nations. And the result of this is the decolonization of most of the world by the time the Soviet Union collapses. And so by the time we get to the 1990s and the early 2000s, most of the world is now independent. Again, not all. The United States has plenty of colonies still and territories. But for a European perspective, Europe, that old guard Europe, has lost its luster. Europe is no longer having the colonies throughout the world. Rather, they are going to seek, we see in our next lecture, to join together to better their economic outlooks. So until next time, take care.